Survivors. Flood, Mississippi, 1927, Chapter 7. The night seemed to last forever, the rain starting and stopping a dozen times. During one lull, Garrett shifted against the log, straightening his legs. He half rolled into a sitting position, careful to keep his right leg on the pole. Molly hadn't opened her eyes in a long time. Garrett couldn't imagine sleeping, but she seemed to be at least dozing a little, her hands still tight around the rope. Garrett released his grip and rubbed at his face. A big welt on his cheek let him know that there were mosquitoes out now. He switched hands and gingerly touched his right shoulder. Though he couldn't remember when, the pole must have hit him hard. Molly turned without opening her eyes, and Garrett noticed the sack half beneath her right arm. If there was twine left, he could tie the pole down. It'd be a relief to be able to stop worrying about it. Molly stirred again, turning so the sack would be impossible to reach without waking her. Then he remembered the twine Molly had used as a tow rope. The water was calmer, but he was afraid to trust the river. Keeping his leg across the pole and making sure he always had at least one solid handhold, he scooted to the front edge of the raft. A 5-foot length of doubled twine was trailing in the water. He fished it out, using his pocket knife to cut it. Then he folded the blade. He was careful to settle the knife deep in his pocket. His daddy had given it to him, and he was not going to let the damnable river get it. The twine was stiff, and Garrett was afraid to let go with both hands, so it took a long time for him to get the pole secured to one end of the raft. When he finished, he was tired and his stomach was churning empty. He put the thought of food aside. There was nothing to do about it. An odd tapping sound caught Garrett's attention. He turned to stare out over the water and was startled to see the distant line of treetops. Squinting, he looked up. The moon had set. Dawn was beginning to gray the sky. The tapping came again, barely audible above the sound of the water. Garrett turned, switching hands on the rope, careful to keep his balance as the raft rose and fell. There. Something was riding the current almost parallel with the raft. He couldn't tell what it was. It was too small for a boat, and he couldn't see any people. But it wasn't just some loose boards or fence planks. Garrett glanced down at Molly. "You awake?" he said softly. She didn't move. He turned back to the river. Whatever it was coming a little closer as the currents jostled each other. The water seemed to be moving faster again. Garrett looked upriver, relieved to see nothing above them but brown water. The tapping started up again, and Garrett strained to get a better look. It was a metallic sound, almost like a toy hammer striking a nail head. The current suddenly arched back beneath them, rising like a giant's catback. The raft slewed to one side, moving diagonally. It vibrated. The logs shivered underneath the conflicting forces. Garrett scrambled closer to Molly as she opened her eyes, sat up, startled. He steadied her with one hand while she flexed her fingers, then gripped the rope once more. She stretched her spine, shrugging her shoulders. "The rain finally quit?" She said it so matter-of-factly that Garrett found himself smiling at her. Molly was the only person he could think of who could wake up, on a raft, in the middle of the Mississippi, and talk about the weather like she was sitting on her own front porch. "At least for a while," he told her, then started to laugh. "What's so funny?" she demanded, staring at him. "You could use a comb." She made a face at him and raised her hands to push her hair back from her face in a quick motion. Then she grabbed at the rope again. "You aren't exactly Sunday meetin' presentable yourself." He smiled at her again. "What's that?" Molly asked, pointing. Garrett turned to look. The sky had brightened a little, and the squarish shape suddenly made sense. "It's a chest of drawers, floating on its side. A lot of houses must be ruined." "I hope both of ours are all right. Do you think our levee could crevasse?" Garrett shook his head, an image of his mother and sisters running through rising water coming into his mind. He blinked and pushed it aside. "No," he said quickly. "The levee had been there a long time, and it's not like the old ones up at Leota or Scott's Landing. It'll hold." Molly shivered and looked across the water. She smiled in disbelief. "A chest of drawers," she said. "Listen to that. You can hear the brass drawer pulls. They're swinging back and forth." Garrett nodded. The chest was only about 20 feet away now. "Let's get a hold of it if we can," he said. Molly turned to face him. "Why?" He shrugged. Maybe we could break it apart. Use the pieces for paddles? Molly arched her brows and smiled. And the river's going to do the work this time, I think. She gestured toward the chest of drawers. It's closer already. Garrett crawled to the edge of the raft and felt Molly grasp his shirt tail. You be careful. I will. The words were barely out of his mouth when the raft, nose downward, carried along a steep wall of water. Garrett flopped back over, crawling for the rope. His fingers snagged on it, and his fingers convulsed into fists as he hung on. The raft began to spin, and Molly shouted something at him, but he couldn't understand. The vortex of the current roared around them, and Garrett looked up. He blinked, unable to understand how the brown water had so quickly shaped itself into a funnel. He had to look up to see the surface of the river. As he watched, transfixed, the chest of drawers tumbled over the rim, falling straight downward for a ways, then slanting into a spin, as the raft had done. Garrett glanced at Molly. Her eyes were closed, and he willed her to hang on. Then he closed his own eyes, sickened at the sight of the impossible wall of water. He could hear Molly's rasping cry as the raft tilted. It seemed to blend with the whirling motion of the current. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the spinning of the raft slowed, and finally stopped as it leveled out. Garrett opened his eyes. Molly was flat on her stomach, her face buried in the crook of one arm. He nudged her gently with one foot, still too afraid to let go of his handhold. Molly sat up, her rose-brown skin an ashen color. I want to go home. Garrett waited patiently as she sniffled a little, then apologized for wailing like a baby. He wanted to say something comforting to her, but everything he thought of sounded plain foolish. He couldn't say if they were going to get off the river all right or not. He couldn't tell her he wasn't scared half out of his wits. He could only sit silently as she pulled in one deep breath after another. Finally she pointed. There's your chest of drawers. Garrett followed her gesture, glad to hear her voice sounding steadier, more like her usual self. The river was playing tricks again. Somehow the chest had gotten ahead of them, but not very far. It was floating even lower in the water now, too. Hold my ankle, Molly, he said, and waited until she had blinked twice, then nodded. Then he stretched out on his belly and began to drag himself toward the front of the raft. At the edge he stopped, staring straight down into the murky water. How deep was it here? His daddy had told them that in some places the Mississippi was as deep as 50 feet. The thought caught at his heart, and for a second he couldn't breathe. Then he looked up and very nearly banged his nose on the side of the chest. Can you get it? Molly was shouting. Garrett reached out a cautious hand. The drawers were facing him now, in an uneven row, each one open, the way Ivy and May left their chest after they had rifled through it looking for a toy or a doll shirt, except that this chest was much finer than anything May and Ivy would ever have. Garrett closed his fingers around a drawer pull and scrooched back a foot or two. He had to tug pretty hard, but the drawer slid out farther. He jerked at it, and it came free, rattling onto the raft. He sat up quickly, jackknifing around to lay the drawer between him and Molly. Hands shaking, he reached for the rope and clutched it. But this time the river stayed steady beneath them. Garrett stared at the smooth oak wood and wondered how much perfectly good furniture was floating down the river. His mother would have given anything for a chest of drawers as nice as this one. As he watched, the chest tilted to one side, floating unevenly now. It sank deeper into the water, and the raft bumped it once, then went past it. Garrett could see just the top of the chest as it fell behind them, then disappeared from sight. I wish we could have taken it home, Molly said wistfully, echoing his thoughts. Garrett shook his head. It would have just warped to pieces, as soaked as it was. Loosening one hand, he began to examine the drawer. It was shallow, only about 4 or 5 inches deep. The front and back were 6-inch planks of heavy oak. The drawer bottom was thinner wood. He gripped the brass pull and twisted. It stayed firm. He sat up, holding hard to the rope with his left hand. I wish we still had the hand axe. How are you going to break it up? Garrett shrugged. He lifted the drawer one-handed, hefting its weight. I can try to break it against the raft logs, he told Molly, if I can hit the right angle. Turn your head in case it splinters. Molly shifted around until her back was toward him. He raised the drawer as high over his head as he could, then smashed it downward, turning it a little so the side of the drawer would hit hardest. There was a satisfying crack, and when Garrett lifted it, he saw that one of the side pieces had come free. The bottom of the drawer had split in 2 or 3 places. He worked it back and forth, widening the biggest crack until the board broke. It took 2 more hard whacks, but the front of the door finally broke free, the brass pull still firmly attached. It was fit to use as a paddle, as was one of the side pieces. The remainder of the drawer had been reduced to kindling. Garrett handed Molly the side piece and scooted to the upstream side of the raft. Cautiously he dipped the drawer front into the water, and it was almost snatched out of his hands. He hung on, skidding, managing to stop only a few inches short of falling into the brown water. "Not there!" Molly yelled. "On the side, like it was a boat." Molly nodded, shifted his position again, shaking his head at his own foolish mistake. If he'd fallen off the raft. "Can you hear that?" Molly shouted at him over the sound of the water. Garrett looked at her. "What?" "I hear a dog barking." Garrett shook his head, ready to tell her that she was just imagining things. But then he heard it too. It was more of a howl than a bark, the kind of sound a coon dog made if it was bleeding and hurt, left all alone in the dark.